Let me welcome Annie Evans. Thank you everyone for being here today. This is the final of our 4-part series on teaching students in Virginia about Black history. Annie is here from the Virginia Commonwealth University, and University of Richmond. Beg your pardon. University of Richmond. We've known each other for 30 years. So
I did get my master's there, so I'm sort of from there too.
Okay, so we'll give you credit for that. Okay, great.
Yep.
I've known her for a long time. When she was from the time she was a middle school teacher. Her bio is right on the screen, and so you can read that. She didn't want to go through a lot of hoopla about introducing herself, so she said, "I'll just put this up and they can read it." At any rate, she's going to be talking with us from the perspective of not only a former middle school teacher, but also a person who works with National Geographic and also National Geographic Alliance, and also from the university perspective of the new American history. So Annie, take it away. It's yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us this morning. In the chat, there is a link to the slides. I use Google Slides because those are the tools that most of our K-12 educators are using. And as Camille said, I am now currently at the University of Richmond, and my job is to take all of the digital scholarship of our director, Ed Ayers, who is a historian and former president of the University of Richmond. And when he stepped down from his role as an administrator at the university, he went back to some teaching and writing books, but more importantly, he turned the majority of his attention on K-12 education, improving history and geography and civic education. So Dr. Ayers and I spend the majority of our days now working with college professors and K-12 teachers and students. I develop learning resources using a variety of digital tools that Dr. Ayers has created over the lifetime of his career. And most of those tools are now housed at the University of Richmond Digital Scholarship Lab. And one of the things that Dr. Ayers and I have been spending a good bit of time on the last 2.5 years is working with our Virginia Department of Education on first project was the African American History Education Commission. And this is where we worked with about 25 other people across the state, K-16 educators, policymakers, community members, to take a really hard look at what we were teaching in Virginia in terms of African American history, but more importantly, what we were not teaching. And out of a 1.5 years of kind of focusing this lens on that aspect of our curriculum, we were able to make a series of recommendations to the Virginia Board of Education in the fall of 2020. The majority of those recommendations were accepted. In addition to making some revisions to what are called the curriculum frameworks. The curriculum frameworks are the document that is created at the Department of Education once the state standards are adopted. The SOLs, you may have heard of those. You may have children or grandchildren who took SOL tests. And about 25 years ago, the standards of learning tests came into our public schools as a way to hold schools accountable, part of the No Child Left Behind mandates of the George W. Bush administration. So we've been living with SOLs for over 20 years now, and there are some things about that we, as educators, we realized right away probably weren't going to work for a lot of kids, but it took a while for the policymakers to catch up on that. Now there's kind of a shift going back towards moving away from high stakes testing. And we are looking at now assessing kids through what they call a balanced assessment plan, a variety of types of assessments. For science and social studies, ideally, these would involve what are called performance tasks, having kids actually do something with history, do something with science to demonstrate that they've learned the skills, not just memorized facts. So that's sort of where we are on the educational landscape now in Virginia. The bills that were signed into law about 1.5 years ago, there's a picture there from the bill signing ceremony. This is where they adopted the changes that were recommended. It's also where a high school African American history elective class was funded and adopted and developed. We also had a lot of input on what went into the class and how it would be taught. There was a pilot for 1 year where 20 teachers across the state were teaching this new African American history course. Then they gave us feedback. We tweaked the course a little bit further. And this current school year, despite the pandemic and all of the challenges that you're hearing and reading about, which are 10 times more, I promise you, in any school on any given day. But even with everything going on, the teachers who are teaching this course this year and the students who are enrolled in this course this year, from everyone I've spoken with, are 100% engaged. The students are really enjoying the course. The teachers are enjoying teaching the course, and they've already sent us a whole other list about, we're a little more than halfway through the year. They're already starting to send us a list saying, give us more. We want more. Here's what the kids are curious about. Do you have anything on this? And so the folks at the Department of Education and our team at New American History are working really hard to try and help develop as many resources and tools as possible, as requested by teachers and students. The other piece of that was that it's not enough to change what we're teaching or to develop a course. You also have to consider that not every teacher in Virginia, just like many of us, we're not taught a full and complete history, because our curriculum in the past over generations has left a lot of things out, or only told American history through perhaps one historical narrative. And so just as we are improving the standards and we are making sure that we're telling a full, complete, and honest story of American history, we also have to go back and fill in some of those knowledge gaps for teachers, and to be honest, with parents and community members. And so you've probably heard a lot in the news in the recent months. We've had a change in leadership here in Virginia, as have many states. There are lots of debates almost every night. If you turn on the evening news or you read a newspaper, you're hearing about these culture wars. You're hearing terms like divisive concepts, and you're hearing, there's a teacher tip line, and all kinds of things are in the news. And I always just like to peel the Band-Aid and rip it off right at the beginning and address any questions that people might have about that, so that we can kind of jump into the content this morning. So Camille, I'm going to pause there and ask if there are any questions, burning questions that people just need to have answered before they can listen to the rest of the presentation. Looks like David has a question. Do you want them to put it in the chat or unmute themselves, Camille? What's easiest for you?
Brendan, do you open the chat up, or do you ask people to state their own questions?
It's up to you both.
I think David raised his hand first, and then it said there were two others. So Brendan, you can just unmute them as you see them.
Yeah, you need to unmute them. I don't think she can see them all.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't see anybody for Camille.
Go ahead, David.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Hi.
Hi. Do you, from your opening, it sounds like your ultimate view is going to be that all this uproar is very much a minority and very exaggerated, and that most parents and students are very satisfied with the new approaches. Is that where you come out on this?
I think that there are, I would say, just as with everything else that we're kind of seeing on the political landscape the last few years, I think our country and our community and our state are very much divided in our political views, and those are now sort of clouding into our ways that we are influencing what we're teaching and learning in history. What I will say is students, the majority of the students that I work with, and even though I am at U of R now, my job is to push in and help teachers. And part of the way I help teachers is model lessons with their students. And so I do 2 or 3 days a week, get an opportunity to work firsthand with students. Most of the students, when they ask me about the things that they're hearing in the news, they don't seem to understand why the adults are so worried. They have said things to me in the last several months, like, do they think we don't already know we have the internet, right? Why are parents trying to ban books? We can get those books other places. We don't have to just read them in school. I've already read the 1619 Project. That's been one of the big controversies, is the 1619 Project. I already read it, it's online, right? And so what children are saying is, first of all, they don't many cases feel the same way the adults do, right? I think as adults, Many adults don't feel comfortable right now having these discussions with their own kids, or they don't feel comfortable having their child learn about these concepts, perhaps partly because they didn't learn them themselves. And so they, a lot of people don't feel comfortable not having all the answers or not knowing something that their child comes home and has learned, right? There are many people that makes them feel uncomfortable. Others are worried that they don't want their child to be exposed to things that are sad or unpleasant. But the world can sometimes be a sad and unpleasant place. And I think, especially in the last 2 years with the pandemic, a lot of our kids have been through a lot. It's been a rough couple of years. But students, I find if you're honest with students, they appreciate that more than anything. And I think that our goal with the changes that we, suggested to the curriculum, with the materials that we make and that others are making, is just to tell the truth and give kids the truth and be very upfront and honest. Not every part of American history or world history is pleasant. And people are human and they don't always make good decisions and they don't always do the right thing. And those choices and decisions that humans make can have far lasting consequences, whether they realize it or not, whether they did it on purpose or not. And all of that goes into teaching a more full and complete history, and not just about African-American history. Our charge was only to look at African-American history, but this is the year that all of the history standards were already up for revision. So we're kind of in the middle of an overall rehaul of all of the standards: world history, K through 12, US history, K through 12, geography, government, civics. So everything will get a fine-tooth comb glance at it. And I think that as adults, if adults continue to argue over this, it just makes the kids want to go check those books out of the library or go find this information on the internet. And if we say to a teacher, you're not allowed to talk about this, or you'll get in trouble, or we're going to revoke your teaching license, or you're going to get a bad evaluation, or you could lose your job, teachers are going to not talk about it because many of them can't afford to lose their job right now. But the danger in that, in my opinion, is if we don't discuss it in school, they're going to find it on the internet anyway. And then they have no one to talk about it with, no one to process that information, no one to help them understand, and no one to help them make sure that they're looking at credible sources, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. So I think before we start banning books and taking topics off the table and saying to a teacher and a student, you're not allowed to talk about this in school, we need to think very carefully about where else will they come across that information, and how will they know that they're really looking at good, credible sources? Because in school, we teach them how to vet those sources, right? So David, I hope that was not too long of an answer, and I hope that was helpful.
It was, and thank you very much. And I'm very glad you're doing what you're doing.
Thank you. I truly love it. There were a couple of others with their hands up, it looks like.
All right. Yep. Bob, go ahead, Bob.
Yeah.
Bob.
One of the things that's been interesting, you pointed out, Annie, was the fact that I have a lot of holes in history that I learned in the 40s, 50s, 60s that were down a one track, this is the way it was type thing. And so it's been interesting in the last number of years to fill some of those holes. And your presentation is doing just that. But the other thing is online teaching. Although you have developed a great curriculum, have you found that to be a real challenge now as well? Because a class like you're giving, it requires interplay back and forth between students asking and taking in information so that they really understand what you're trying to teach.
So I don't teach an online course per se. The materials that we create are digital. And the reason that I push into schools that way, mainly the last 2 years have been the pandemic, obviously. Before the pandemic started, I was going physically into schools in Virginia 2 or 3 days a week, demonstrating the use of these tools. I taught in a one-to-one computer classroom for over 15 years. I started off in Henrico County in Richmond. We were one of the first school divisions in the country to get a laptop for every student. And so I started teaching that way. About a third of the way through my career, we suddenly had access to these tools and resources. And right around that time, Dr. Ayers, who I didn't know at the time, was kind of a pioneer in developing these digital tools. He was an early adopter as well. I actually used one of his tools about the Civil War. I don't know if you've ever heard The Valley of the Shadow or if you've ever read any of Dr. Ayers' books, but he's a scholar of Southern history and particularly the Civil War era. And so he kind of brought to life all of these diaries and journals and primary sources. One of the first historians in the country to digitize them and make them accessible to children everywhere. I happened to stumble across his work and started using it with my students. We couldn't get a bus to go down to the National Archives in DC every day, right? But a lot of these resources were now right at our fingertips. And that was a game changer for students. And then, after that, the internet took off, and all of a sudden, Camille and I, who used to teach with a paper textbook, we had access to all these, maps and tools and videos and audio clips. And so I've taught online courses and I've taught face-to-face, and there are pluses and minuses to both. I think all children should experience both. There is a law in Virginia. About 7 or 8 years ago, they passed a law that you must take one online course to graduate. And a lot of parents pushed back on that in the beginning. But I think it was smart. Well, first of all, look what happened these last 2 years. Thank goodness our kids had that, they already knew kind of how to navigate an online course. Virginia was way ahead of the game in that. But also many of the classes they take in college are going to be online. All of the college classes the last 2 years went online. My niece is at Georgetown. She was already taking online classes and face-to-face instruction at Georgetown. What she liked about the online courses, she said, was that she could do it whenever it fit her schedule. So, there are some pieces of online courses that you can't get with face-to-face. And you also can do some things in a face-to-face course that you can't do online. So I think we need variety, and we need.
Thank you very much, and let's press into the course because we want to listen to what you have.
All right, there's a couple more questions, Camille. Do we want to take those now? I don't want anybody.
Can you hold off on that for a couple of minutes till we get into the slide presentation?
All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So here are some of the changes that we made, and I'm starting with kindergarten and first grade. And you might think, oh, they're so little, they're so cute. They don't need to know about all this stuff. But the small things that we changed, I think, kind of set the foundation for being successful in school. And so this little pink chart you see in the bottom left corner, I know it's very small. That's why I gave you a copy of the slides so that you could look at them in more detail when we're finished this morning. But this is a chart that kind of shows all of the skills. And I've in the presenter notes of the slides, you should have a link so you can go to the actual document and look at it whenever you choose. These are the skills that we teach in social studies, not the facts, the skills that they will continue to add to and hone and refine all the way through their adult lives. They will use these skills. So in kindergarten, we start with some very basic skills. The lighter the pink means you're introducing the skill. The medium pink means they're getting better at the skill. And the dark magenta means by that age, they should know that skill pretty well and be able to move on through the continuum. And so what we do is we look at the skills by grade level. Teachers can see, here's the things that they should have learned before they got to us. They don't always, but at least they kind of know where they're coming from and what direction are we heading in. And we kept these skills in mind as we were revising the standards. So just minor tweaks where it talks about in kindergarten, they mainly are talking about my community and starting to learn about what it means to be a citizen. And that kind of continues into first grade. But it used to talk about community members. You can learn about them through event stories and legends. Well, legends implies that it may or may not be true. And we changed that one word, narratives. Narratives gives that just a little bit of a different meaning these are true stories, right? They're not legends, they're not myths, they're not fairy tales. These are the stories of real shared human experiences. And just that little tweak, we've had so many teachers who work with our youngest learners say, wow, I never thought about that, but I was kind of presenting these like it's story time now, right? And I didn't really maybe emphasize that these are people who really made big contributions to our country or our community. Adding in the Juneteenth holiday, certainly that's a new state holiday. So we wanted to recognize that. When they get into first grade, there was not a lot of diversity in the people's stories that we were telling. And so we added in things like Doug Wilder was our, first African-American governor in Virginia and in the US. That's a significant Virginian we thought kids should start to know about. And so we moved through the different grade levels. And in some grade levels, this is Virginia studies. This is where kids primarily learn Virginia state history, 4th or 5th grade, depending on where they live. And so a lot of the information there was very surface. It just said the first Africans arrived in Virginia against their will in 1619, but they didn't really set any context for that. So what Dr. Ayers and the other historians, Cassandra Newby-Alexander down in Hampton worked on this project with us. They wanted to make sure that we weren't just having kids memorize facts, but they actually had a little bit more context to the story, so that they would not just say, okay, I just have to memorize at 1619, right? We don't want kids memorizing facts anymore. We want kids really understanding history, and we wanted to put human faces and shared life experiences behind the history. And so tonight and tomorrow, I will actually be, tonight I'm doing a virtual program for Fort Monroe, which is the site of the first African landing in 1619 in the United States, in the colonies. And then tomorrow I will be at the fort doing an in-person workshop for teachers. And one of the tools that I'm sharing with them, this is a map of forced migration. So this is a digital map that Dr. Ayers and the Digital Scholars Lab created, where they can go through several decades showing how slaves were brought in and where they settled based on the different commodities that were being sold and traded in the United States. And so it is a very graphic way to explain just the enormity of the slave trade. I think it's easy to say, this many slaves were bought and sold, and then you move on to the next chapter in a history book. But when kids can manipulate that data, I'm going to come out of the slides here and kind of show you how that works. When kids can manipulate the data, they are able to kind of make meaning out of it. But what I think is more important is they can also read narratives, firsthand accounts of people who live there. So when you get into the map, there's a slider tool down here, and you have a link to this map in your notes. As we go through each decade, you'll see the map change. The areas in blue show where people were coming in, enslaved people were being brought into the country, and the copper areas show where they were moving towards. So if you notice, Virginia continues almost as soon as they land, and also in coastal South Carolina, those are the largest slave markets. As soon as they arrive, they're immediately going towards where the cotton and sugar crops are the largest cash crops in the 1800s prior to the Civil War. Virginia tobacco, by then we have exhausted the soil. We are no longer growing much tobacco at all. We grow a little wheat and corn, but one of our biggest crops, one of our biggest commodities is human trafficking, right? And so the students learn a little math and science because we're using some data over here, but then they also can read the human side of it. So if you click on these different dots, these are going to give you the statistics, how many people enslaved in that county, no matter, I'm going to go up here towards Fairfax, that's Loudoun. There you go, Fairfax County, how many, the out migration, 803 people during that time were being sold, how many people were being enslaved, what was the overall population, but then they can also read stories of the people, putting that human face on the history. So that's one tool. That's just an example of, we learned it in a paper textbook. This is how kids today are learning it. And they're getting their math and their data lesson at the same time. In science, they're learning how to read graphs. Let's apply those skills to history as well, right? So for each grade band, we are able to go through and look at kind of some of those changes. This is US 1. This is typically taught in 5th or 6th grade. This is one of the standards that had to do with the actual Civil War. And we had a lot of information in there that very much glossed over some of the truths about that time period. You've probably heard the phrase, the lost cause theory. One of the gentlemen who spoke earlier said that he learned history in a different era and that a lot of things were left out. And one thing that our kids, we talk to them about now is that in the time period right after the Civil War up through the 1950s or 60s, the textbooks were shaped by organizations like the Daughters of the Confederacy. And so particular narratives were ingrained in the official curriculum. When I first started teaching in 1989, the textbook that they were using to teach Virginia was from 1967, I believe. It was a very old textbook. And I was kind of shocked that they were, first of all, using books that were almost older than I was, but the way that the history was being presented in that textbook, it had nothing to do with what I learned in Fairfax County growing up as a child. And so I had to pretty much make my own materials back then. And I was talking with Brenton, our moderator, earlier about one of the projects Dr. Ayers did was called the Valley of the Shadow. And it was this Civil War data. And he created a database of letters and diaries and public records that you would find in a local historical society. And he digitized all that for two cities, Stanton, Virginia, and Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, to give students the perspective from both a northern and southern town during the Civil War. So those were the types of materials that my students were engaged in because the textbooks were not telling the full and complete story. Things like saying that the Civil War was fought over states' rights. In the new standards, we are letting the students know the Civil War was fought over slavery, right? It was not an economic, they made it sound more like an economic venture rather than, no, people were being bought and sold. And this is the economic reality of why these two parts of our country went to war. And then we kind of just lay out, what some of those reasons were on both sides, what people were believing and what they were fighting for, but we're being pretty honest. And so if you look at what was taken out of the curriculum and what was put into the curriculum, a lot of it is just giving kids the information and then giving them tools like the one I just shared with you so that they can kind of process it and read about it and start to form their own opinions rather than asking them to memorize these 3 things about the Civil War so that they can pass a test. I'm going to show you another tool that here on the bottom of your screen, this is Bunk. Bunk is, the first time I saw Bunk, I thought it was Nerd Pinterest. Some of you may be on that website Pinterest where you can pin a board. The first time I saw Bunk, this looked like a giant Pinterest page to me for history nerds. And so what this is we have 6 or 7 students at the University of Richmond every semester who work with Dr. Ayers and our team. Tony Field is our Bunk editor. He has a background in journalism. And so he and the students comb the internet every morning looking for stories that relate to American history. And they put them onto this website through a very elaborate tagging system and an algorithm that tags every piece of content to any other related piece of content currently in Bunk. So I'm gonna pick, and it changes all the time. It sometimes changes more than one day. This is an interesting one that we've been talking about as teachers for the last week or so. I don't know if any of you are familiar with a program called Grammarly. It's sort of like spell check if you use Microsoft Word. Grammarly is something that you can add on if you are working on the internet and you're typing something, it'll correct your spelling and your grammar. Seems harmless, right? Well, Grammarly made some changes in the last 2 or 3 weeks so that when it gives you suggestions to improve your writing as well as just correcting your spelling and your grammar. And they made some changes based on feedback about when people type in sensitive topics such as slavery. So some of the feedback that people got was kind of, oh, what? You're correcting my words that I'm using, you're correcting. So it's not just fixing the spelling of the word, they're actually suggesting, hey, you might want to say enslaved person instead of slave, right? So there's quite a bit of controversy. Should your programs like this behind the scenes be giving you suggestions like that, or should they just be correcting your spelling, right? And so this has created quite a controversy among teachers, especially English teachers and history teachers. With Bunk, you've got these tools where you can find other pieces of content that has something to do with the same idea, the same person mentioned in the original article, or a related time period. So if I want to say what else is out there in journalism and scholarship about this same idea, when you click on view connections, you see this deck of cards and you see tags. Our students are tagging all of the content relating to other topics such as slavery, slaveholders, historiography, historians. When you go through the cards, you notice that the topics change and the tags change. So a student can select these topics. If they want to find out more about it, they can click on a tag. There are 248 other pieces of content in Bunk related to that topic. They can click on, this is a brand new database that just came out last month. How many members of Congress historically were slave owners themselves? If you want to look at articles with the same people, the kids can go through, and any member of Congress who's mentioned in another article or anybody related to that article, there's other pieces of history there. So let's look at Henry Clay. We've got 35 pieces of content. So you get the idea. Kids can explore and they can have a little bit of choice rather than just memorizing some facts. They can actually explore. They can build their own collection. If I want to start a collection here, I can add this to the collection. They can take notes. They can annotate it. The teacher can build a collection and put questions in these boxes and push it out to the students for them to answer and submit digitally. So these are all the types of tools that we're building to try and engage students in history and get them to think rather than just memorize. So that's another one of the tools that we're using in that effort. Are there questions, Camille? It looks like the chat's pretty busy, but I can't see the chat when I'm projecting the slides.
Why don't you continue and we'll see in about 5 minutes.
Okay. Oh, let me go back to the slideshow here. So this is 7th grade, 6th or 7th grade, US 2, a few other things. Just talking about Abraham Lincoln, for example, they talk about he issued the Emancipation Proclamation or he issued Reconstruction. That was it. That's all they had to memorize. Again, we're trying to bring these stories to life, put a human face behind it. So we talked about how Reconstruction, his plans weren't all the way fully fleshed out at the time of his assassination. And so, you know, we only know what we know at that time about what he was thinking, about what his plans were for repairing the country. We fully addressed the whole lost cause movement. We talk about that Reconstruction ended before it really was able to make as many changes as perhaps people had hoped it would. And it also talks about westward expansion and the impact it had on indigenous people, right? All my life, we looked at that painting of the angel leading the people out west, taking progress, right? Pioneers. I watched Little House on the Prairie when I was a kid. I read all the Laura Ingalls books, but it very rarely addressed the families and the people who are being displaced, who have been on that land for hundreds of thousands of years. And so we've got to start looking at all of the people who made America what it is today and how one group's choices impacted another group's choices. And when we're fully telling the story, Dr. Ayers always says he wants every child sitting in a 7th grade history class to see themselves in the story of America. And I would say when I was in 7th grade, not all the kids sitting in class with me saw that. They saw a lot of stories about people who looked like me, for sure. Native Americans were only mentioned at Thanksgiving. They were briefly mentioned at the Trail of Tears, and that was about it, right? And my African-American friends were oftentimes only saw themselves either as slaves or they saw themselves fighting for civil rights. And then after that, there wasn't a lot of mention about accomplishments. There wasn't a lot of mention in the curriculum about people who successfully led businesses, ran political campaigns, or other accomplishments really past the 1960s, very rarely mentioned. And so we want to make sure that everyone's stories are getting equal weight in our curriculum and that our kids are learning complete and honest narratives about America's past. And we want to give them the tools that they will find engaging to do that. This is US 11. So lynching was not addressed at all in the standards. It is a difficult topic to talk about. It's difficult for adults to talk about. It's difficult for teachers to explain, but to send a student away to college having never discussed lynching as part of learning about American history really was doing a disservice to our students. Also, the Great Migration was barely mentioned. And so we added a good bit of information. Once kids get to high school, they're a little older, they can handle a little bit more challenging content, as long as we've done a good job in those younger grades laying that foundation. So a lot of the changes that were made primarily were in those upper middle school and high school level courses. One of the tools that we are using to kind of explain migration, very similar to that forced migration map that showed you where enslaved populations were being bought and sold. This is a project called Southern Journey. This is what's called a GIS story map. Geographic Information Systems is the mapping technology behind the scenes that is used in the GPS that you have on your phone or in your car when it tells you into a website that students can manipulate and scroll through and find information. But more importantly, we also teach students how to make their own story maps. So again, instead of passively reading a textbook and memorizing some facts and then spitting it back out on a test, we're trying to get kids to not just be consumers of knowledge, but producers of knowledge, actually doing something with the material so that they will really learn it in a deeper context. And also at the same time, develop those skills that are going to make them more successful if they choose to go on to college or out into the workforce. So the map you see on the bottom left is called Southern Journey. And in a way to explain the migration patterns, there we go. We can have students manipulate the map. They can scroll through these maps on their own. They can find information rather than us telling them the answers. And they can also eventually learn how to create their own presentations like this. So kind of think of this as the next step to the good old PowerPoint, right? They can create animation. This is showing the contraband camps, including Fort Monroe during the Civil War, where self-emancipated people could go and seek shelter with Union Army camps as they were seizing their own freedom, so to speak. And so kids can learn how to create this using these digital tools. Very similar to the forced migration map. Again, same color scheme here, just a little bit more sophisticated technology. The blue shows where people were leaving, and the gold copper color shows where people were moving towards. So we're looking at the Great Migration through both the white and black populations, so students can compare. It adds a little bit of context there on the left, but students are also able to scroll through using these tools, looking at places like where were people living in small towns in the 1880s, and now you see more people moving into that Southwest and then moving up towards the Northeast as railroads became more prevalent. I'm going to pause there, Camille. Are there any questions?
I'm going to let Brenton handle that because he can see everybody.
Yep.
Okay.
There are a lot of questions in the chat.
Okay, let's address some questions.
All right. Suzanne's asking, how are you engaging parents? I'm not sure if that was.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, we're hearing a lot on the news about parents. You know, not all parents agree, and not all parents have agreed historically through time. And so I think it's really important more than ever. I'm not a fan of the idea of a tip line. I'm just going to be honest. I don't think having a tip line where people are anonymously reporting their child's teacher if they do something that they don't like, I don't find that a productive method. I think it's more important that schools do a better job of communicating to parents upfront what they're doing, but asking teachers to post their lesson plans a year in advance is not a realistic, in my opinion, is not realistic, mainly because it takes away what we think of as the teachable moment and those current events like we're seeing on Bunk, the website I shared earlier. To ask a teacher to predict what's going to happen in the world a year in advance and post all of the materials that they plan to use to teach that is impossible. To ask a teacher in June to post their lesson plans for the coming school year before they've even met their students makes no sense to me, because good instruction includes getting to know your students and getting to know their strengths and weaknesses. And that happens during the course of the year, not before school starts. And so we need teachers to have the flexibility to adapt their daily instruction based on what are the students understanding, what do they know, and what do we need them to know. And we can't do that by posting things a year in advance and then locking our teachers into that and saying you can't use anything except the things that you posted last June. So I think it's more important to have multiple opportunities for parents to come to school. My classroom had always been open. You know, obviously I'm not going to have all 30 parents in a class show up on the same day because that creates a safety issue. But if a parent said, hey, you know, I'd really like to come in and observe what my child's learning, you know, you make those appointments on a person by person basis, not during a pandemic. Maybe you don't want to bring any more germs in the building than you have to, but you know, in a normal regular, if we ever have a regular school year again, but you know, having parent conferences, a big trend now is not having parent teacher conferences the way you and I experience those, which is where I, as the teacher, met with the parent. We talked about the child when the child was still at home that evening or sitting out in the hall. Now we have what are called student-led conferences where the students are leading the parent-teacher conference. The students are preparing a portfolio of 2 or 3 things that they did that 9 weeks or whatever time period of what they feel most proud about their work. And then the students are telling their teachers and parents what it is that they still don't understand or what they're curious about or what they'd like to learn more about. And sitting in one of those student-led conferences is a powerful experience. I would like to see us move towards that model. A lot of schools have already in recent years started adopting that model. And parents have said to me, wow, I really wish we had done this sooner, right? I had no idea that my child was really interested in music and the history of music. And because of that passion, now I can't get him to stop reading about Louis Armstrong, right? Or I can't get them to stop reading about, you know, Broadway show tunes or whatever it is that the child is pursuing. But then they're also learning the history of what was going on during that time period. So they're not just, you know, wasting their time reading about music. Oh, that's not going to get you a job in the real world, but it is going to make you a more well-rounded adult, right? And it could get you a job in the real world. You never know. Your child might be musically gifted. So I think that we need to peel back those layers and barriers between the school and the parent. I don't know how in the last 5 years the school became an enemy and the parents in the schools feel like they have to not get along. I really hope that we in Virginia can move back towards a place where we're inviting families to be included. I've said to parents my whole career, I understand that you have questions and concerns about the way I'm teaching the Civil War or about the way I'm teaching civil rights, because it's not the way that you learned it in school yourselves. It's not the way I learned it. Right? I had to learn that on my own. Luckily, I had parents who took me to museums. We visited historical sites. And I spent a good bit of time talking to the older people in my family, grandparents and older relatives who told me about their shared life experiences. I read biographies as a kid. For some reason, I was really into biographies. So I think that parents and teachers need to be working together. We don't want to be putting these barriers up where we are pigeonholing teachers into a cookie cutter curriculum, and we are putting teachers up to unreasonable scrutiny so that they feel uncomfortable. And we can't say to a teacher, you're going to teach American history, but you can't use these 15 words. I just think that's a very dangerous path to go down. Other questions, Brenton? I saw a couple of hands up, but I can't tell who it is.
Yes. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, one of the things that was interesting was probably about the turn of the year. There was an article in the Washington Post that showed the ethnic location of various ethnic groups throughout the United States from the 2020 census. To me, that now makes a lot of sense because I know just what you were teaching here with Bunk and others. There is a migration of various ethnic background people to various places. And that would be a wonderful assignment in class, is to say, here's 2020, tell me how this happened. And let them create a story And if you had 20 people, you'd probably have 20 different viewpoints.
Absolutely, Bob. There's a professor that we've been working with out in Oregon. And one of the other maps that we produce is on redlining. And I did a presentation for Camille and for Ollie last year.
Yes.
And you've
Richmond.
probably seen this map on the news because it's been in the news quite a bit. Don't know what that happened. Let me try that again. Sorry about that.
This was the one you did in Richmond?
Yes, this is one called Mapping Inequality, and it is digitizing historic maps made by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So any city in the New Deal era, late 1930s up through the 1940s, that had 40,000 or more people in population was scored by this Homeowners Loan Corporation. So I'm just going to use Richmond, Virginia as an example, because that's what I'm most familiar with. This is the fan area of Richmond. This area in between is Monument Avenue. Right along there would be Monument Avenue. I actually lived in this area in the early 1990s, but the idea behind it, where they had realtors and developers and bankers go out and score these neighborhoods, and the scores were using a template that was created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. We have scanned the original primary source documents in for the kids to look at. We've also transcribed them here on the left, so they're a little easier to read. But they would capture demographic information, who lived there, their race, their ethnicity, sometimes their religious beliefs, their median income, how much it cost to buy or rent a home there. And the idea was that it was to pull us out of the Great Depression and decide who was a good risk for a home loan. But what also occurred was it documented some of the biases that these lenders and developers had built into what are called racially restrictive covenants. And so my old neighborhood, I lived on Monument Avenue in a very small apartment that used to be a single family home. And it was, during the Depression, a lot of people had to start renting out rooms. They turned into boarding houses, eventually permanently moved into apartments. So here's an example. It talks about this area, though seemingly more desirable, is in conversion to rentals. Rentals was a dirty word, right? Rentals meant not good anymore, not a good risk. Owners are moving west. By moving west, they mean the beginning of the suburbs, right? They're moving west out of the city into these segregated neighborhoods. So it goes on to talk about how Monument Avenue was a beautiful boulevard with shade trees and monuments to Confederate celebrities at important intersections, right? So when we pull up these descriptions and then we talk to the students about why the monuments were a subject of protest, right? For many, many decades. When were the monuments put up? They were not put up right after the Civil War to commemorate heroes. They were put up during the Jim Crow era. There's a big difference there, right? Who put them up? Why did they put them up? And more importantly, why were they put right in that area of Monument Avenue? If you go back to the map, they were put there because these blue and green neighborhoods were where the wealthy white families were living, and they did not want African Americans in their neighborhoods. And so these red areas, which is where the term redlining comes from, this was the dividing line. Here's the industrial area. You stay on your side of town, we stay on our side of town, right? And that's where the monuments were. They were the dividing line. When kids can see it visually this way and read these descriptions, it's a lot easier for them to kind of understand what was going on. And then the next step, like I said to Camille earlier, like it's not enough anymore for us to just teach them history. They have to do something with history. And so in Charlottesville, we didn't have 40,000 people. We're not in these original maps, but we know those sort of practices went on. So when I was working in the schools in Charlottesville, we had the students working with a local journalist. He took us down to the courthouse and taught the kids how to pull public records. We pulled every single property deed in the city of Charlottesville. It took us 3.5 years. We started off with UVA students and high school students. Pretty soon we taught middle school students how to read through the deeds. They would find all of the racially restrictive covenants and tag them. And then we mapped them out and made our own map of redlining in Charlottesville. That's called Mapping Seville. And it took a number of years, but we have now mapped the entire city out, and now we are working on building a map of the surrounding Albemarle. Those kids have learned more. Some of them started in middle school, they worked on it in high school, and now they're in college and they're helping on their own time, in their own free time, mapping out the Albemarle County.
And they're history majors now, right?
So many of them are, and some of them have actually gone into GIS. So we're teaching these skills, these mapping skills. They're getting great jobs out of it, right? And they've learned all these other skills that they can translate, how to make a presentation. Even if they're not going into a history-related field, they now know how to gather data, collect data, analyze data, and create a presentation that makes sense to other people on a variety of topics, right? We were
Very
not
good.
that skill when we were teaching them facts to memorize on a multiple choice test.
Thank you so much.
So the other thing I want to share with you, if you have children or grandchildren who are in the schools, when all of this new content was added to the standards, obviously the textbooks did not get updated, and some of them won't be updated for a while. So we took all of our resources, many museums around the state of Virginia, many historic sites, many other teachers and organizations like New American History. We crowdsourced all of our greatest hits, so to speak, into a document that's housed on a website that the Department of Education helps us populate, where everything that you need to teach that new information that we've added to the standards is linked in there, so that the teacher doesn't have to, go back and find everything to teach this new content. We've already matched up age appropriate content that matches the new information that we put into the standards of learning framework documents. And so everything is already right there for the teacher. If we couldn't find something to teach that, then we created it over the summer. And so teachers can go into this database and they can pull out resources for whatever grade level they're teaching. So I'm just going to take you out to that live website. So you can search by grade level, you can search by topic, you can search by standard. So this is the 11th grade course. They can go in and search by keyword. These are all new lessons that we all helped create to help that teacher teach that new content. So it's not one of those unfunded mandates that leaves the teacher with even more work and it's an added burden on the teacher. And these are all publicly already available. Teachers and parents can look at these. I always encourage the parents, if you're feeling uncomfortable about what your student's learning about, most of the content that teachers are putting, even when they're teaching your child face-to-face during the day, they're putting them up on a website. They post them on a weekly basis. And yeah, sometimes they don't post them till that day, because guess what? If the lesson didn't go great yesterday and the kids just weren't getting it, as teachers, we know that we need to find a different way to explain it. And so we will come in the next day. And maybe we did overnight change what we were planning on doing. That's called good teaching, right? And if you pass a law that says we have to put it all up in June for the next year, we don't have the flexibility to do that. So again, we've got to trust teachers and we've got to build better relationships between the parents and the teachers, not pass laws that divide the teachers and the parents more, in my opinion.
You've got to educate the parents now to go find it.
Absolutely. And that's what Dr. Ayers and I are trying to do. So we do presentations for school boards. We do presentations for parent groups. I just did a session for parents in Albemarle County a few Saturdays ago. And we had so many people with COVID restrictions, we had to do another session the second Saturday so that everybody who wanted to come, we were able to fit them in safely. And so we actually did it twice, just so that everybody who wanted to hear more about this would have that opportunity. So our website is New American History, and this content changes every month. Bunk, I've already shared with you. I've shared some of the maps, some of the other things that we have. I don't know if any of you guys ever listened to the old Backstory podcast. Dr. Ayers was one of the co-hosts of Backstory. Backstory ran for about 12 years. It started off on the radio. My students used to stay after school with me on Fridays so they could listen to that as I was getting the room ready for the next week. I had a little group of kids that just loved to stay back and listen to that with me and discuss it. And then it became a podcast when that became a thing. Backstory ended a couple of years ago, and Dr. Ayers is now supporting a new podcast that he is not the moderator, but he is working behind the scenes on some of the content. It's called Seizing Freedom, and Seizing Freedom just started their second season. And it's kind of like radio theater, where you are listening to the voices and the words that were pulled from primary source documents like diaries and journals, where people are talking about emancipation, the Reconstruction era, and they've hired amazing voice actors. So it's almost like listening to an old time radio show, and then in between, different historians are interviewed. So if you like to listen to podcasts, all of the backstory archive has been cut up into shorter segments, so teachers can just use, a 5 or 6 minute clip. They don't have to listen to the whole hour. And Seizing Freedom is the same thing. They have the hour-long podcast available online, but they've given me access to shorter segments, and I'm writing learning resources for teachers that let them just use pieces of it embedded along with the maps and bunk content and other tools to make the kids have multiple ways to learn it. The other piece that we have is video content. So Dr. Ayers hosted a show on PBS for about 2 seasons called The Future of America's Past. You can still find those episodes online. I have cut those episodes. They're about 27 minutes long, but I have, again, cut those up into shorter segments. 3 of them are specific to Virginia. One is on Freedom's Fortress, which is at Fort Monroe. So it's a half-hour visit to the fort, talking about the history from 1619 all the way up to the Civil War contraband, all the way up to today as a historic site. Another one is about the flu pandemic. It features Maggie Walker. Many children used to only learn that Maggie Walker ran a bank. And that's all they had to memorize to pass the test. But Maggie Walker did so much more. She was a civil rights leader in Virginia. And during the flu pandemic, she actually saved hundreds, if not thousands of lives, because she put her foot down when she realized that African Americans were not getting the same level of health care during that pandemic. And so in this lesson, the kids compare the 1918 flu pandemic to the current COVID-19. And this was produced during the pandemic and pushed out virtually into schools. Also, Barbara Johns, the young 15-year-old student from Farmville, Virginia, who led a student walkout way before Rosa Parks led a bus boycott. We had a young lady in Virginia fighting to integrate schools and to get equal educational opportunities for her and her classmates. And so there's a half-hour episode at the Moton School. The learning resources that I create pull in all of this content. We pull in bunk, we pull in the video, we pull in the podcast, we pull in the maps. We tag everything just like we tag things in bunk. I tag things for the appropriate grade level. Here are the different topics that teachers are teaching about, so that the teachers can easily access multiple resources to help teach the content that they need to teach. One of the lessons that we did when Representative John Lewis passed away, he left this beautiful essay that was printed the day after his passing. We create a learning resource where students are creating their own collection in bunk, like I told you about. They're comparing maps. All the questions are in there for the teacher to go. I'm sorry, was there a question?
Somebody just muted themselves.
Okay. Anyway, so this is just an example of some of the learning resources that I've created to go along with the content to help the teachers with those African-American history technical edits. But teachers are using these in other states. We're working with teachers all across the country. Looking at that original redlining map, here's that map we looked at earlier. We're also working with science teachers. We're talking about, in those covenants when I read to you about the Monument Avenue with the beautiful shade trees. Well, if you're living in those blue and green neighborhoods now with climate change, those shade trees are providing better air quality, and they're also keeping the temperatures down. But if you're living in those formerly redline neighborhoods, this is Jackson Ward, which was Maggie Walker's neighborhood. They didn't have as many green spaces or shade trees. And so now scientists are doing urban heat island studies where they are realizing that if you're living in an area that does not have landscaping and shade trees, on the edge of an industrial area where there's a lot of toxic waste, this is a word cloud made out of all the area descriptions, like the one I read to you about my neighborhood on Monument Avenue. These are the most frequent words used to describe the red, yellow, blue, and green neighborhoods. And if you take a look, if you're living in a red neighborhood or on the edge of a red neighborhood in the yellow, you see words like sewer, odor, treeless, industry, swamp, dump. But if you're living in a blue or green neighborhood, you see shade, golf courses, landscaping, parks, wooded, right? And so it's a very different environment. And that we now are studying that people who live in those red and yellow neighborhoods often have higher rates of diabetes, obesity, high blood pressure. And so when COVID hit, those were the families that were being most impacted because they had so many underlying health concerns to begin with. And part of it had to do with what neighborhood they were living in. So all of these resources are available for free. I've put a couple of other groups that we work with. There's an excellent film called How the Monuments Came Down that really explores the whole history of Monument Avenue. And it leads right up into right before the monuments were taken down. But it talks about the political backstory, the historical backstory, and it interviews many lifelong residents of that area on both sides of the argument. And it's a really exceptional film that we now are using as a teaching tool. So if you search on BPM, which is the Richmond PBS station, and I've linked direct links out to the film, you can look at the film. My friend Rodney, who was the National Teacher of the Year and is a Richmond City teacher, developed beautiful learning resources to go with the film. We hosted a screening for students and teachers right before winter break, and the kids really loved the film, and they appreciate the honesty. Governor Northam's in it. He completely owns up to the entire blackface issue. He doesn't try and shy away from it. He talks to the students directly through the film about how he had a lot to learn about American history and how, you know, he needed to make corrections to his own thinking about history. So it's a pretty powerful film and it doesn't pull any punches. Are there more questions, Brenton?
Yes. Lee, did you already get your?
I'm going to stop sharing so we
No,
can see
no.
each other now.
So
Are there other
I-
questions?
Yes, I was, I think your material is all wonderful. I have two related questions. One is how widely you think it's being used by teachers in Virginia? And two is this, you mentioned being not a fan of the tip line, but do you have any sense of whether the tip line, how much is being reported? I would think that some of the people there'd be some of the parents who were voted for people about race and how race was being taught or might be being taught would be using that tip line, and it might be intimidating teachers. So I'm really interested in how
Yeah,
widely it's
so-
used and whether they're reluctant to use it because of the new politics.
Yeah, so unfortunately, the current administration is not releasing to the public the comments made on the tip line, which I think is unfortunate. In the past, that's always been a pretty transparent thing. If the government sponsored some sort of a website for public comment, those public comments have always been made public, right? In this case, they are currently not releasing any of the comments made on the tip line. So we have no way to definitively say how many parents are using it or what types of things are reporting. What I will say is many parents were not happy that the tip line was created. And from what I'm reading online and in the newspaper and seeing on the news, like many of you probably have heard, some parents and have taken this as an opportunity to flood the tip line with good comments about teachers who are doing a good job because they don't want to send the message to their child or their child's school that it should be an us versus them. And I really applaud those parents. I think that that's a wonderful gesture. And I don't think that was the intent of creating that tip line, but that's how many parents have used it. I don't know how many parents have called to make actual complaints, but it seems to me that I just don't think as a teacher and as a taxpayer, it makes sense to use an anonymous tip line because I don't think that that's instruction and forming good relationships at the local level is what's going to impact students most. And so as a teacher, I had plenty of parents who came in and said, my child came home and this is what they said that you said in class, and I don't like that, or I don't agree with that. And I would always sit down with the parents. I would share whatever materials we had used in class. And the other thing I would kind of joke it back to school night. I would say, I will only believe half of what the kids say happens in your house. if you only believe half of what they say they heard in class today, because I guarantee you the truth lies somewhere in between. And then we would usually laugh, but kids come to school and tell a lot of wild stories about their families and the things that are happening in their homes. Some things I don't think parents really want their kids sharing with the entire class because, I've had kids say some pretty wild things over the years, but knowing that parents also realize that sometimes kids come home and what they heard or what they thought they heard may not be the whole thing, right? And so I think that that's where we need to have an opportunity to sit down with parents and work that out at the local level, not doing it administratively or not doing it with government intervention. Like I feel like parents that have legitimate concerns should always feel welcome at a school. And if schools aren't doing a good job making them feel welcome, then that's where we need to build those bridges. That's my opinion.
Okay, but what about the teachers? Are they using this material? Do you think they're being intimidated about using this material?
We have had teachers using it in lots of parts of the state and across the country, but there are some teachers who have contacted me in the last 3 or 4 months and said, last year that lesson about Barbara Johns and the Moton Museum was our kid's favorite lesson, but I'm afraid to use it now because I don't want to get in trouble, right? Or, we really liked your map of the enslaved Africans and we want to use it, but we're afraid we're going to get in trouble. And I think that that's so sad that we now have teachers who are afraid to teach the truth because they don't want to.
Yes, my question is, as you pointed out on the news almost nightly, we see these board meetings where parents are really irate about what their children are being taught, and they keep on using critical race theory, which, my understanding is it's not really being taught as critical race theory on the elementary level. What can we do as the public to make sure that, these programs that you're talking about are taught to the children? And my second part of the question is, are you optimistic about this and if so, why?
Okay, I'll take the first part. There are several bills right now in the General Assembly that are trying to limit what teachers can and can't teach. There are some bills that are trying to either keep certain SOL tests or do away with certain SOL tests. My thinking is that, especially for science and social studies, I feel that science and social studies need to be hands-on and more engaging and interactive, just by the nature of what it is that we teach and how we teach it. I do think that there needs to be periodic math and reading tests because those are the foundational skills. So much of what we do in science and even now in social studies with data, you need to have some of those core foundational skills. And I think that it is appropriate, periodically during elementary, middle, and high school to test those maybe in a more traditional testing method. So I think if we can take a look at, we definitely have been over testing children in the past, and we have successfully lobbied as history teachers to do away with some of those SOL tests and replace them with what are called performance tasks. So like what I described to you, where we taught the students how to read those property deeds and find the historic information and then map it out. To me, those kids learned a lot more about history and a lot more life skills and career skills than memorizing a bunch of facts to take a test, right? So I think if we can support legislation that gives teachers and schools the freedom to use performance assessments instead of high stakes multiple choice, that's always a good thing because to me, that's good teaching. I also think that we need to let our elected officials know that we trust teachers and that we want to work with teachers and that teachers are human, they're not perfect. Teachers are going to make mistakes, just like I'm sure you have all made mistakes occasionally in your lives and in your work experience. I did not teach the best lesson every single day. There were days when I worked really hard on a lesson and I went into that classroom, and I'm sure Camille felt the same way sometimes, and it just didn't fly. The kids didn't get it, or like what just happened to us here, the technology didn't work right. But what I love about kids is many times when we had a day where something didn't work right, kids would leave that room and say, Miss Evans, it's okay. we know that you tried best, and this is still our favorite class because A, you always tell us the truth, or you always keep us interested, or you actually know us and you care about us. So it's okay if everything doesn't go perfect every day. And I think that if teachers and kids and parents are all in that mindset where we are all lifelong learners, I have learned so much the last 2.5 years working with Dr. Ayers. My teaching and my experiences get better every year. I want the kids to feel that way. If they know that they are going to learn the rest of their lives, and it's not our job to teach them and cram into their head every little thing that they need to know, that's impossible. But if we teach them how to find the information and how to look at information and find the truth in the information based on what is fact versus propaganda, what is a reliable source versus somebody that is sitting in a basement somewhere making up their own history and putting it out there on the internet, people who are, from other parts of the world trying to influence elections and things like that. The internet is a great tool and technology is great, but it's only as good as the hands that we put it into. And if we teach kids how to use those tools the right way, then they will continue to use them their whole lives. But if we tell a teacher and we tell a kid, you're not allowed to do this or that, then we limit them and we limit their choices and their possibilities in the future, I think. So I think contacting your legislators, letting them know that you support the work that teachers are doing and that you support teaching a more full and honest and complete curriculum, and giving local school divisions the autonomy to figure out what it is that their kids need. So for example, I'm working with people in Montana where they had nothing in their curriculum about the indigenous populations, even though 70% of their students are from indigenous backgrounds, right? 70% of their students did not see themselves in the textbooks and did not see themselves in the lessons. So we're developing local history curriculums. We did that in Charlottesville. We did that in Henrico. So we're working with school divisions, to make sure. I have a friend that teaches in California. 68% of her students are Asian American. She is the only Asian American teacher, not in her school, in the entire school division. She is the only Asian American teacher. And so she's working on recruiting more Asian Americans into the teaching force. But why would anybody want to enter the teaching force now when teachers are being attacked, right? We're making it impossible to develop the future great history teachers, the future Camille Hodges of the world, right? How are we going to, recruit people who love history or love science and want to teach it when we are setting up this us versus them feeling between parents versus teachers versus schools? So I think building bridges, not putting up divisive laws and policies and procedures. You need to let your legislators know that it's important that we not create more barriers to opening up those doors of communication. That's what I think we can do for our kids. That's a great question. Thank you. Are there others?
Yes, Ginge is asking, what do you see as the implications of aiming Elizabeth Schultz as Assistant Superintendent for Education?
What is the implications of aiming?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what you mean by aiming. Well, I think that
Of naming her.
anyone that we put in a position where they are overseeing the educational scope and sequence, whether it be at a local division level, at a state level, or at a national level, that person needs to have, in my opinion, that person should have classroom experience. Just as I would not want someone who is not a medically trained doctor to be diagnosing my health concerns, I think having someone in that position who has been a teacher or a university professor, who has a background in education and knows something about not just the economics of balancing a school budget, because anybody can do that. We have school finance people to help us do that, but really understanding how kids learn, knowing learning theory, knowing adult learning theory versus what's appropriate for elementary versus what's appropriate for middles or college age students. Those are the people that should be leading it. So anyone whose name is proposed to be the Secretary of Education, whether it be for a state or for the entire country, I think that person needs to have an education background, not a political background, not a business background. They need to be someone who has been actively engaging in teaching for a portion of their adult life. That's my thoughts on that. Any others?
All right,
Questions?
some people feel parts of American history will be lost or corrected by filling these knowledge gaps. What do you think?
They think that parts of history will be lost by filling the knowledge gaps? Like, in other words,
Lost
they
or
think
corrected.
I think what we're trying to do by filling the knowledge gaps is to correct things that weren't being taught completely or were only being taught from one perspective. Our goal with all of the standards revisions, not just this year or in the last 2 years, we revisit these standards every 7 years by state law in Virginia. Some states do it every 10. Every state works a little differently, but I think it's healthy and it's important to take a look at what you're teaching. I think 7 years, to be honest with you, is a little too, I would like to see that be every 5 years, but it is a very expensive process and it takes a long time. So at least Virginia does it every 7 years instead of every 10 years. There's some states that haven't redone their standards since the 80s or 90s. Now think about that for a minute. Nobody has changed what they're teaching in the last 20 years. The world is a very different place. So I think that it is important, again, if we give some local control up rather than having everything be top down from the national government or the state, I think giving teachers, getting these barrier tests, these multiple choice tests away gives you the opportunity. I think kids should start off local. What was happening in Charlottesville, what was happening in Richmond, what was happening in Fairfax during that time, then what was happening in Virginia, then what was happening in the United States, then what was happening out in the world. When you teach history through that kind of a lens, kids really buy into it. Because just for example, Charlottesville, there's a park called Tonsler Park. Kids go there every day after school to play basketball. I took them to our local historical society to do research, and there's a exhibit there about Benjamin Tonsler, who was one of the founders of the city of Charlottesville. And the kids looked at that and they said, "Is that the guy from the park where I play basketball every day?" And I said, "Yes." And they started reading about Benjamin Tonsler and the contributions he made to the city. And suddenly it became very real to them. And that day, instead of going to play basketball, the museum director said, "I've got 9 of your kids here after school wanting to come in and do research." And I said, "I'll be there in 10 minutes, right? I mean, what a great way to hook kids in when they make that local connection. And then we talked about, what was going on in Virginia. And then that led to a richer discussion when we got to a few weeks later in their American history class back at school. So I think giving local schools the ability to know their kids and know what their kids need, and know the population of kids that they're serving and build those good relationships with the parents is way more important than putting up a bunch of barriers through laws or policies or silencing teachers or silencing what kids are allowed to read or access. If you don't want your child to read that book, that's your decision as a parent, and you can have that conversation with the teacher. But as one parent, we shouldn't be saying that book cannot be made available in the library for other kids whose parents may want them to read that book, right? I think anytime that we put up walls or barriers and limit what kids can read and learn about, it's not one family or a small group of people to take away from the many. So that's just my personal thinking on that. And I've been in schools where parents attempted to ban books. And I can tell you the first thing the kids did was went to a public library or went online and found a copy of the book and they read it. They all read it, right? Because the grown-up said not to. That's just human nature. Are there other questions, Brenton?
Yes. Books like Stamped and movies like Just Mercy are helping to fill the gaps in my history knowledge. What are other things would you recommend to us baby boomers?
I would say that those episodes of The Future of America's Past have they're short, but they pack a lot into an episode. So there are links to that in the slides. I would say the Monuments film that I also gave you a link to would be a great thing to look at those curriculum materials that are included in that link. The Just Mercy film is actually connected to Brian Stevenson has the Equal Justice Initiative. We use a lot of his materials. We have linked out to those in some of our learning resources. We took students from Charlottesville. I was the social studies coordinator during the time of the Unite the Right rally. And Heather hired the young lady who was killed that day. Her mother is actually a local teacher. She came in and talked to our students on several occasions, but we actually took 100 citizens of Charlottesville, including high school students, teachers, and Heather's mother went on the trip, as well as several other members of the community just paid their own way. And we actually did what we called the Seville Pilgrimage the summer after the Unite the Right rally, where we stopped at 11 or 12 historic sites on the Civil Rights Trail and ended at the Equal Justice Initiative. And the students had participated in going out to the site of the only confirmed lynching that's been documented in the Charlottesville area. A young man who was murdered in Albemarle County. And so they collected 2 soil samples. One of those is in a jar to commemorate his name was John Henry, and they left one sample at the local historical society, and then the other one was taken to the Equal Justice Initiative, where they have a wall full of jars with soil samples collected on the spots of confirmed lynchings. And a lot of people have said, well, what good does that do? That's just a bunch of dirt. But symbolically, what it represents is the untold stories of all of those people, like the Emmett Tills that many of us did not learn about until we got to college, right? There was a series recently on ABC, a 3-part series that included the story of Emmett Till. I think ABC will still let you watch that. That was an excellent series. There have been HBO had a series called Watchmen that illustrated the Tulsa race massacre. So there's so much available now with Netflix and Amazon Prime. If you want to email me, my email is in the slides. I'd be happy to send anybody, other lists after you've tried a few of the ones that I just mentioned. Bunk, yes, bunkhistory.org. The slides, Bretton, if you could put the slides again in the chat for me, since I'm not able to on my phone. If you download that link to the slides, it has links to everything I showed you, plus so much more that we didn't get to. It has links out to the standards that were revised. It has links out to Bunk. It has links out to the map. It has links out to our learning resources. So you can kind of see the lessons that I've created along with other teachers working with us. Everything that I've shared with you today. I have a lot of kids now who say that instead of reading the newspaper in the morning, they just read Bunk. Right? Because they love clicking on the different things and they can kind of explore what topics they're interested in. And I've had teachers and kids, what I really love is kids will pitch us ideas. They'll read something in a newspaper or a magazine and they'll send it to me and say, hey, Bunk lady. If they can't remember my name, I think it's hilarious when they say, hey, you're that Bunk lady that came to my class last week on Zoom. Have you seen this article? We think it should be in Bunk. And many times I send it to our editor. And if he thinks it fits, his criteria, it'll go into Bunk, and then I will send the kids the link, and they get so excited when they see that their recommendation made it into Bunk, right? Or a teacher will have the kids read 2 articles in Bunk, and they'll create a new tag, like something else that they think it should be tagged, and they'll send us the tag. And if our editor agrees, he'll add that tag in. Think about what a great way for kids to, if you said to the kids, read this chapter and answer these boring questions, they're done, right? But if you say to the kid, read these 2 articles and tell me what you got out of it and what connections you made, and what other tag might you add to that? There's a lot more thinking involved there. And then they actually see you taking their opinion and putting it on the website a couple of days later. There's power in that. That's the kids harnessing control of their own learning. And I love to see that.
All right, and I think the last one, what are students in Virginia being taught about the massive resistance movement after Brown versus Board?
So the Barbara Johns lesson that I referenced is linked into the slides. And so we have a whole lesson that looks at the student walkout at Moton and how that led to part of the Brown versus Board decision. There's also for the little kids, this is not part of New American History, so to speak, my day job, but the Virginia Geographic Alliance is an organization that is made up of K-16 geography professors, geography and history teachers. Camille and I, that's how we met. They produced a paper atlas for many years, which was basically like, old school atlases that we grew up with, which was just book of maps of Virginia. And we distributed that to elementary schools all across the state. We had 3 different editions over the last 25 years. A couple of years ago, we decided to create a digital atlas for little kids similar to what I showed you that we had made at University of Richmond. That is called an Atlas of Virginia. And we had hoped to find a funder that would help us make it available to every elementary school in Virginia. And we had a couple of people who were interested in funding it, but we never found anyone who would absorb the cost. You know, you have to pay for the domain name, you have to pay for the upkeep of the website, you have to have somebody available to fix broken links when things aren't working. And so there are some associated costs. You know, the teachers that created it didn't get paid to make it. They made it because they knew that everybody needed it and wanted it. But now we're looking for ways to get it out. We finally had to start selling it for $200 per school for a 1-year subscription, which most software like that costs a couple of $1,000s a year. So we, you know, teachers finally said, or schools said, just, we'll give you $200, just set us up an account. So we've got about 20 or 30 of the 132 school divisions have bought a subscription. This is the first year that it's been out. It's not even been out for a whole year yet. We've had a couple of people call, like last week, someone called and bought the Atlas for the entire school division down in Southeast Virginia. Someone, a single donor said, I will buy a 1-year subscription for every elementary school in my county. I was like, wow, okay. So, you know, if anyone's interested in sponsoring a school, you can email me. But I really wish that we would find a way. We had hoped the Department of Education would find funding to make this a resource that every school has access to. I don't want it to be where some kids have it and some don't. It's just, I don't have the funding behind me to make that happen yet. I keep looking every day. You know, I've applied for a lot of grants and things like that, trying to get this into the hands of as many little kids. What I do during the day for University of Richmond is geared towards 4th through 12th grade and college. But this is specifically something that K through 4 kids and really up K through 8. And it also includes information on science, social studies, and language arts. So a lot of science teachers are using it. We've got maps of hurricanes and tornadoes and sea level rise and all that. It's got a lot of economics built in. It talks about the businesses, the agriculture, the industries in Virginia. So it's a pretty amazing resource, and it's all very interactive. There's some, you know, easier, simpler maps where kids can click on things, kind of like the ones I showed you from American Panorama and New American History, but it's for little kids. And so we're still hoping that someday we'll be able to get that into every elementary school.
All right.
Any more?
I think that was the last one. I'll send you the rest of the chat, but
Okay.
we are out of time, I believe.
You guys have been very patient. Sorry about the little glitch here with the losing the connection at the end, but I hope this has been helpful. I hope it's answered some of your questions. Please contact your elected officials. Please let them know your feelings on what we discussed this morning. It would mean the world to a lot of kids and a lot of teachers. And if you know a teacher, and even if you don't, like, just call the closest elementary, middle, or high school near you and just say, how can I help? You know, what can I do? You could write a letter. You could, you know, volunteer time once it's a little safer with the pandemic. You could, you know, talk to people that you know in your social network that can help support history education. We can all play a part in this, and we all should.